Welcome to our television and radio audiences worldwide. This is Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. We welcome now from Capitol Hill our very special guest, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. So, Madam Speaker, thank you so much for joining us. A lot is going on this morning, at least according to the news. First of all, start with the most basic thing. Is it true, in fact, that the Secretary of the Treasury, Steven Mnuchin, has now raised with you the possibility of a broader stimulus deal once again?
Well, I wouldn't speak for him on what he may have suggested, but I will say that I think we have a clear understanding that if we're going to try to help the airlines, and we certainly want to do that, that it has to be in the context of a fuller bill. They don't have to happen at the same moment, but they have to be happening with the assurance of that we will go beyond the assistance to the airlines. They have to crush the virus. So let's just be calm. Let's try to normalize things. Unless we crush the virus with testing, tracing, treatment, mask wearing, sanitation, ventilation, separation, we're not going to get a handle on this to be able to fully open our economy and our schools and our society. That is what has been ignored by the administration. That's what we must insist upon in this package. It's been in other bills, but they haven't acted upon the resources in a way that science would require. So that's that. On the subject of the airlines, I have made the case to my colleagues that this is a special case because in order for airline employees to return to the workforce, there are national security concerns, there are concerns about certification and all the rest of that, not just somebody leaving a job and coming back to a job, but having to requalify. It could take a couple years for a pilot, 6 months for a flight attendant. So right. I do think that we should pay special attention to that, but that we cannot do that and then lose all leverage to do everything else that we have to do in the bill, which is to crush the virus, honor our heroes, put money in the pockets of the American people. And I do, I have a confidence that when we're having the conversations with the Secretary and we're exchanging paper, it is for a purpose.
Madam Speaker, are you speaking to the Secretary directly? Because there are reports that he raised with you the possibility of a broader stimulus deal, even at this late stage. Are you speaking with him directly? Has he not said that to you?
I have that inference to be drawn from our conversation, yes, and most recently last evening. I don't know what time of day it was, late in the day yesterday, that we're always hopeful we're at the table. I've said we're at the table. We're not leaving the table. This has to happen. But again, it can't happen unless we're legislating. That means we're writing words, and we need to have their acceptance of the fact that we must crush the virus. Now, if they have amendments to the words, well, show us what that is. But they have recognized they have not responded to that very important part of how we go forward. There is a national plan. It is strategic. It is funded, and is what we must do according to what the scientists tell us is necessary to crush the virus.
Madam Speaker.
It also has the funding for vaccines as well, which will be very important. We hope and pray that we have one as soon as possible. Not one day sooner than it is safe and efficacious, not one day later. And hopefully that will be soon, because that is an answer. But for that to happen, people have to have trust that it was done scientifically, not politically.
Madam Speaker, in the past, you said you don't think that President Trump himself has to be in the negotiations because you can work with Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin.
Right.
At this point, President Trump has changed his position quite a bit with tweeting out, let's call off all the talks, and maybe we should do some of it. Do you still have confidence, not in him as a person, the Secretary, but does he have the ability to speak for the President? Because it's awfully hard, as you know so well, to do a deal if the person you're dealing the deal with doesn't have the authority to close it.
I believe he has the authority to do so. The president is, shall we say, in an altered state right now, so I don't know how to answer for his behavior, but it doesn't mean that we would not try to narrow the differences. A lot of work has gone into it. We would not have committed all of that time, and well, time is everything. It's life. It's life. We're trying to save lives. We are not going to be enablers of more people dying because we walk away from the table. We're there. and I hope that they will be there. And I think that we have no alternative but to work with the Secretary. But he understands the challenges. We have a difference of money in certain places, but the difference in language is also something that I believe we can resolve. It will take compromise, but that's what a negotiation is about. So I have confidence in the Secretary. I think I have confidence that the President does too. And I can't answer for the President's behavior.
Well, you talked about the altered state, as you called it, of the President, and you said just a short time ago that the public needs to know the health condition of the President.
That's right.
Do you have questions about his capability to really serve in his office at this point?
Well, what I want to know is the trust that we have to place in the executive branch at this time, the trust we have to place in a vaccine that may become available, that it is scientifically approved in the clinical trials, as well as the advisory committee that must pass on all of this, and that it is not political. So I don't know that the motivation of the White House is strictly based on science. I think they've demonstrated in this coronavirus, as well as climate change and any other issue, that they have contempt for science. But what I said about the President was that we don't know if somebody who, I've not said this, I've quoted others to say there are those who say that when you're on steroids and or if you have COVID-19 or both, that there may be some impairment of judgment. But again, that's for the doctors and the scientists to determine. But it was very strange, really surprising, and I'm rarely surprised, when the President took to the tweet and saying that he wants the Senate to have full focus on this confirmation of the justice and turn the attention away, and so we're stopping the negotiations. He'll do anything in his power to overturn the Affordable Care Act, to take away the pre-existing condition benefit and all the other benefits contained in the Affordable Care Act. We know that. But for him to stop the negotiations in order to make the confirmation as fast as possible for someone to be there in time for the November 10th oral arguments in the Supreme Court to overturn the Affordable Care Act at a time of a pandemic.
Madam Speaker, I want to come back to something you mentioned, which is the special situation with the airline industry.
Yeah.
And as I understand what you're saying is, you do agree it might be handled a bit separately, but it has to be part of an overall deal. That's to say, it doesn't have to be one statute. It doesn't have to be one bill. Is that what you're saying? So it is possible to do something maybe a little more quickly for airlines as long as you have agreement on the rest?
Let me be clear. We want to help the airline workers, the workers. We want to help the airline workers. There is legislation that we had in the CARES Act, which we hope that we could continue for another 6 months or so. That expired the end of September. We can do that separately, but we cannot do it unless there's a big bill. So it could be part of a big bill, or it could be separate from a big bill from a timing standpoint. But there won't be anything unless we have crushed the virus, put money in the pockets of the American people. Our view, and this is what we are told over and over again. The fiscal soundness of state and local government is important to the fiscal soundness of our economy. We are a consumer economy. Putting money in the pockets of the American workers, especially those unemployed, immediately is spent, injects demand into the economy. It creates jobs. It is a stimulus. So we have a big, tall order to do here, but none of it can really thrive unless we crush the virus. The president seems to be thinking, well, the vaccine will come along, but that's still months away. People will die. Nearly 1,000 yesterday, 50,000 more infected. We have a plan. We have a plan. Let's get it done. So it's not just about putting more money into the Oval Office for the president to have at his discretion with no commitment to the science. So I'm always optimistic. I see everything as an opportunity. And maybe the president, seeing the reaction to his walking away from the table is the opportunity that we have to go, for them to come back to the table, for us to get an agreement. And the sooner, the better. The president says he wants to wait until after he wins the election, from here to eternity. Even if he were to win the election, it's still another month of people being infected, people dying. Let's get the job done now. People's lives depend on it. Our economy's success depends on it. Our children's flourishing in schools depends upon it. This is a tall order for us, and people say to me, you're not going to solve all the world's problems in one bill. I know that. This is corona-centric. That's what it is. But we're not going to solidify disparities in communities of color, whether it's at the education level, the outreach for the coronavirus, or the services rendered by the state and local governments. We're not going to solidify those disparities. We're going to do so in a way that is fair. And when we do the vaccine, which I hope will be soon, we'll do so with ethics and equity in how it is distributed, so that nobody feels it was just there for those who are wealthy or live in a red state, but it's there for all Americans. And as I say that, again, prayerfully hoping that it will be soon, but also based on science for its safety and its efficacy. And I salute our scientists at FDA for what they are doing in that regard.
Madam Secretary, you have been very clear, abundantly clear, that the priority is to crush the virus, as you put it, and you need the broad stimulus to get that done. Is it your impression or understanding that right now the priorities of the White House, of the President of the United States and the White House, are different from that he is more concerned right now with confirming Judge Barrett to be Justice Barrett than he is with crushing the virus?
That's what he said yesterday. That's what he said yesterday. And not only that, that's what he has been saying for the past that this is not a priority for him, starting from the beginning when he said it was a hoax, it was magically going to disappear, it was going to be a miracle. I think the miracle is science. I think as a person of faith, I think that science is an answer to our prayers. But there's nothing in the president's past behavior that indicates that he has the respect for the recommendations that scientists have universally proposed to end the spread of the virus.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Speaker. Really appreciate your time,
Thank
as
you.
always. That is Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, and thanks to our extra radio audience joining us today on Bloomberg Cable. Thank you for joining us. Coming up, Frank Luntz on who won the vice presidential debate last night. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
The vice president and the president were informed about the nature of this pandemic. They knew what was happening and they didn't tell you.
When I look at their plan that talks about advancing testing, creating new PPE, developing a vaccine, it looks a little bit like plagiarism.
You respect the American people when you tell them the truth. You respect the American people when you have the courage
Which we've
to be a
always
leader
done.
speaking of those things that you may not want people to hear, but they need to hear so they can protect themselves.
The reality is that we're going to have a vaccine, Senator, in record time, in unheard of time, in less than a year. The fact that you continue to undermine public confidence in a vaccine, if the vaccine emerges during the Trump administration, I think is unconscionable.
That was the two vice presidential candidates last night mixing it up on the coronavirus in a very different debate than we saw last week between the candidates for president. But in the end, let's be frank, we all want to know who won. And for a preliminary reading, there is no one better to ask that question of than Frank Luntz, who specializes in real-time focus groups for debates just like these. And he's back with us now for what he learned last night. Frank, thank you so much for being here. So you have some results, as I understand it, and frankly, they were a little surprising to me.
Well, let's compare the second debate with the first debate, when everybody felt that the American people lost. Donald Trump lost the most, but neither presidential candidate lived up to what we would have hoped for in this discussion. Turning to the vice presidential debate, if it was about the language used or the issues taken, that both candidates, the evaluation from our undecided participants from undecided states was that they both did pretty well. They both articulated their positions effectively. But what was the tiebreaker to them is how they performed as people, how they presented themselves, whether they were presidential or not. And on that, it was almost unanimously they chose Mike Pence. They watched the facial expressions, the reactions by the California senator, and they compared that to the occasionally tired-looking vice president, but capable and unflappable. And they thought that Senator Harris tried to get under his skin, and that she failed. And they thought that he held his own when she came after him. And so that's why they felt that in terms of who won the debate, they would say Mike Pence overwhelmingly. And I think you'll find that in the surveys, just as they felt that Joe Biden won the first debate for some of the same reasons.
Right.
That in the first debate, it was Trump's behavior that the public reacted so negatively to. In the second debate, in the vice presidential debate, it was Senator Harris's behavior that our undecided voters reacted so negatively to.
Well, I find that fascinating, Frank. Did they react at all to the fact that, as I observed it at least, I thought that the Vice President Pence, went over time a fair amount, talked over the moderator, would interrupt, things like that. Did they react to that at all? They didn't find that amiss?
Yes, they did. Good for you. And one of the things that, last
Frank?
Because the public does respond to that. They expect a presidential candidate or vice presidential candidate to play by the rules, to stick to the time allotted and not to go over again and again. That was bad. But the expressions and the what I call harumphing was even worse. And all I need to do, David, is take you back to the Gore-Bush debates of 2000. Remember the sighing and the moaning and the complaining of Al Gore during the debate? How that really affected people negatively? It's the same thing now. It's 20 years later, and they still feel that way. There's a certain decorum that you expect from your candidates, and she did not live up to it. He was not perfect, but she did not live up to it.
It's fascinating. So now the news today is it doesn't look like we're going to have a debate as we were planned to on the 15th. That's next week. As the commission said it should be virtual, President Trump said he won't do that. So what is the consequence if we don't have a debate or two here? Who does that help or hurt?
So let's make some news right now. I don't see how Donald Trump catches Joe Biden without having two debates. He is far enough behind in enough states that he will need two direct encounters to compare his vision to the vice president's vision, to compare Trump's policies to Biden's policies. And without that debate, I can't do the math to take him to where he needs to be if he expects to win this election. I think it was a very unwise decision. I am honestly, privately, expecting him to reverse that decision, as he himself does the math, that he's trying to pressure the debate commission, which will not be pressured. I know them. These are very decent, very committed to the democratic process. I think Trump, if he follows through with this, is just determine who wins the election in 2020.
Finally, quickly, Frank, are there enough undecided voters left to make a difference?
That's the whole point. Even in my group, there were several people that I wish had not participated. Because, you start to ask them questions, they're truly undecided. And by the way, the published polls have it at 10%. My polling has it at 6%. What I truly believe, it represents 3% of America, and that is not enough without a couple more debates for Trump to close the gap.
It's fascinating. It's always such a delight to have you on these things, Frank. That is Frank Luntz. He's pollster and founder of Luntz Global. And a programming note now, we're going to take a special look at some of the swing states already covered in our series. This one focusing on Arizona, North Carolina, and Ohio. It's going to air Friday evening at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and then again throughout the weekend. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. 6 people have been arrested in what the FBI says was a plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Officials say the alleged conspiracy involved recruiting Michigan militia as part of a plan to overthrow the state's government. Whitmer, once considered a top contender as Joe Biden's running mate on the Democratic presidential ticket, has become a target of some conservatives who said her statewide orders to wear masks violated their constitutional rights. It's looking less and less likely that there will be a debate next week between President Trump and Joe Biden. The president's refusing to take part after the commission that runs the debates said the event would be virtual. Biden says he will take questions directly from voters on October 15th and is asking the debate commission to move the debate to October 22nd. The president says a virtual face-off, quote, is not what debating is about. Biden says the president is trying to evade accountability and doesn't want to face questions about, quote, his failures on COVID and the economy. The president says talks on a new stimulus package have been very productive. Mr. Trump told Fox Business today negotiations are, quote, starting to work out. Mr. Trump ruled his team out of the talks abruptly on Tuesday. He then asked for standalone assistance bills, including for airlines and individual stimulus checks. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin spoke yesterday about an airline relief bill. Protests around Indonesia turned violent today as thousands of students and workers criticized a new law they say will cripple labor rights and harm the environment. Clashes between rock-throwing demonstrators and riot police broke out near Jakarta's presidential palace. The demonstrators said the law will hurt workers by reducing severance pay, removing restrictions on manual labor by foreign workers, and increasing the use of outsourcing. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. IBM announced a big structural change today, saying it would separate its hybrid cloud and AI business from its services component. We talked earlier today with CEO Arvind Krishna about what the move entails and what drove it.
Pre this announcement, we were a majority services company. Post this announcement, IBM will become over half as a software and solutions company, and even a larger number in terms of overall product. And if I look at the annuity base of the new company, it's about a little over 50%. So if I look at that, that's a very attractive company that promises a different valuation than the current structure. So that is a piece of it, but I think it's actually more the growth and the addressable market opportunity of $1 trillion that I think is driving it. But David, you're closer to that audience than probably I am in terms of how they think and how they react.
So Arvind, what will be the relationship between these two companies? Will they be contracting with one another? Will they be free to contract with other people that might be even a competitor of their sister company?
Both. So absolutely. You unlock growth for both companies by being allowed to partner with those that may be competitors. Certainly for Nuco, they may today not so much be restricted, but others who are competitors of the aggregate may feel reluctant to partner deeply with them. That gets unlocked. No constraints, no restrictions on that side. Now that said, I think it's likely that we're each other's biggest customers on day one post-spin. They certainly purchase a lot of hardware and software from IBM. IBM certainly purchased the services from Nuco in terms of how we run IT infrastructure and so on. So the two companies are going to have a deep strategic relationship, but that is not going to constrain them both from partnering with whoever they want to.
Arvind, what can you tell us about the leadership of the two companies going forward? Who do you expect to be the leaders of the two? I assume you're one of them. And what about Jim Whitehurst from Red Hat? What role will he have going forward?
So both Jim and myself remain with IBM. And a lot of the leadership who runs the businesses at IBM is going to stay at IBM. The leadership who runs managed infrastructure services goes with Nuco. Now, as you know, in these spins, the board, the governance structure of IBM stays in place because the company is staying in place. In the Nuco, we have to create a new board. Once that new board is formed, they'll be able to select its top management team. We certainly expect that they will select many people from the current management team. But as that goes forward, the new board of the company will select the overall leadership. But in terms of the day-to-day operations, a lot of the people are in place. They run infrastructure services today, and they will continue to do that.
Arvind, you clearly want to gain some growth by freeing up the hybrid services and the AI part of the company. Do you also run the risk of losing some, of essentially cross-selling, have customers you can cross-sell both sides of your business?
I think that that's a risk that can be managed, David. So the word I would use is, I don't have any concerns about it, and then I'll sort of say, of course I'm going to be paranoid about it, and I'm going to have lots of work around it, and so I'm going to mitigate any of that risk in terms of how we work. There are certainly common clients across both sides of the business, but the clients tend to contract separately for the different parts of the business already. So we have to go manage that risk. But as I said also, the two businesses will have deep and strategic relationships with each other, and that will also help mitigate that part of the risk. So I think we'll unlock growth, and I think that the risk on the aspect you mentioned can be mitigated.
This is obviously a very big initiative of IBM. It'll take a while, I'm sure, to put it all together, to digest it. When do you expect the spinoff to be effectuated?
We believe, based on history and looking at others who have done similar spinoffs, they seem to take about a year to get done. So I'll say a year plus minus a few months. So that takes us into the latter part of 2021. We have to get through all of the structure of the new company. We have to file to the SEC, the S-10s. We expect that'll happen somewhere early to mid part of next year. You get to get through all of those approvals. You got to get to a final board approval, and that then allows us to impact all this. But I think 12 months plus minus some number of months is probably a good timeline to expect.
Arvind, you and I will say, both understand that when you have this major structural change, it consumes a lot of executive bandwidth. As a practical matter, that probably means you're not going to be looking at other acquisitions or dispositions over that 12-month period. Can you look out beyond that? Do you see further structural changes coming up for IBM to pursue that relentless desire for growth that you describe?
I absolutely expect to be completely focused on acquisitions as well as on organic R&D and organic ecosystem investments. I don't believe we will pause them in this period. You then talked about other structural actions, meaning divestments. We are not planning anything else that is significant. So this will take time. You're right. It is major, and it will take a whole set of people to go get this done. And but in the meantime, we are focused on growing both those companies. So they will take the appropriate actions, whether it's organic and inorganic investments, meaning acquisitions, to go get themselves positioned. We fully expect to be down all those paths at full speed.
That was part of my interview with IBM CEO Arvind Krishna. And now we want to continue this week's look at Michigan as part of our swing state series leading up to the election. Welcome back now to Bloomberg, Debbie Dingell, Congresswoman from Michigan. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. Give us your sense about where Michigan is in this race. We remember last time Donald Trump actually had eked out a narrow win there. How's it looking this time?
Well, David, good afternoon. It's great to be with you. 4 years ago, I was one of the lone voices warning people that Michigan was more competitive than people thought that it was. It's very fluid. Today, I'm feeling better than I have in a couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago, I almost began to get some of those same feelings I had in 2016. Quite frankly and candidly, the debate and then the president's handling of himself as he has gotten COVID in the last few days, as I have been out at several places very carefully, you can tell people are just really worried. The handling of COVID has people thinking long and strong. It's still 26 days away, but I think Joe Biden is in a stronger position than Hillary Clinton was for sure at this time.
Is the COVID issue looming larger than the concerns about jobs and economy? Because I dare say last time President Trump made a real pitch, particularly to Michigan voters, saying, look, you've lost a lot of jobs, I'll bring them back. Now he's saying he did bring them back. But is now COVID more important than the jobs issue?
I think that they both deeply matter. But COVID's impacting people's ability to keep their jobs, to have their jobs. Unemployment's high here in Michigan. It's been higher than it has been. At one point, more than 1 in 4 people had lost their jobs and didn't have them. And he did a very good job 4 years ago, and the Democrats didn't, talking about trade and those issues. But the fact of the matter is that since he's been president, we've lost 50,000 jobs. in Michigan, in my own district, 2 steel plants. One eliminated 350 jobs in May. Great Lakes Steel, which is one of the few major steel plants left in this area, announced layoff. 1,500 jobs were laid off, and most people expect it may close, unfortunately. So people are worried about both of them. Though I want to make it clear, there are still very strong, loyal Trump supporters here. I just think that recent activity has taken some people and energized them more than they may have been.
Congressman Dingell, we had a debate again last night. You talked about the presidential one last week. We had one between the vice presidential candidates last night. And the auto industry and auto jobs came up quite specifically. Here's one exchange between Senator Kamala Harris and Vice President Pence.
Joe Biden is responsible for saving America's auto industry, and you voted against it. So let's set the record straight.
American people deserve to know Senator Kamala Harris was one of only 10 members of the Senate to vote against the USMCA. It was a huge win for American auto workers. It was a huge win for American farmers, especially dairy in the upper Midwest.
Congressman Dingell, there you have it. Pretty stark contrast in exactly what these two positions mean for auto industries. How does it play in Michigan?
Well, so first of all, when you talk about what happened when the auto industry was on the verge of total collapse, it was a bipartisan effort. President Bush is the person that began the initial saving of it, and the Obama administration inherited it. And Joe Biden was a very hands-on person in protecting that industry. And I'll never forget what the vote was in Congress. It was one of the most contentious votes I've ever heard. And Mike Pence was from an auto state, and he did vote against. I don't like to call it the auto bailout. I call it saving the auto industry. That is a fact. I was one of those people that strongly believed that we needed to rewrite NAFTA. And I supported Trump on saying that needed to be, President Trump, that it needed to be renegotiated. The fact of the matter is, the first bill that came forward, Democrats demanded a lot of improvements in what we now call the UMCA. I still call it NAFTA 2.0. Many from the West Coast did not support it because they did not think it was strong enough. It was something I believed we needed anything better than what had shifted so many jobs from my state overseas. But I think we need to continue to work on trade policy improvements, and that will always be a priority for me. And I think any presidential candidate that talks about it is going to get people's support here in Michigan because we've seen too many jobs shipped overseas.
Congresswoman, we have, I think, 26 days left to go until the election. And by all accounts, there aren't that many people who say they're undecided anymore. What could change things in this last 26 days? And let me be very specific. It looks right now like the debate that was scheduled for the presidential candidates next week is not going to happen. And it's not clear what happens on the 22nd. What happens if we have no more debates?
This is what I want to say to you, David. The only thing I know about the year 2020 is that the predictable is the unpredictable. And anything can happen in 26 days. It's a lifetime. I mean, what you're doing Michigan this week, who would have predicted that the FBI would talk about thwarting a kidnap plot on my governor? So we may or may not have that debate next week. I think the president saying he's not going to participate in a virtual debate is even open to potential change, since he does have a tendency to not say the same thing from time to time. Does that debate get rescheduled? October can be full of lots of surprises. It's only the first weekend of October, and we've seen probably many that none of us would have written into our script. So I think that I am somebody who will not believe this election is over until the polls close in California on Election Day. A lot of things can happen, and I do believe that a lot of people we've got to make sure that people turn out. People can just get disgusted with everybody, get tired of partisan bickering, get turned off by all politics, which people are. Everybody's got to make sure that the voters turn out, because democracy matters then, and both sides are very focused on turning out their votes.
It's always a great privilege to talk with you, Congressman. Really appreciate it. That's Representative Debbie Dingell, Democrat of Michigan. And a programming note now, we're going to have a special look at some of the swing states already covered in our series. It's going to air Friday evening at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time and then again throughout the weekend. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Lifting lockdowns isn't going to give the economy a sustained boost as long as COVID-19 infections remain elevated. That's according to the International Monetary Fund, which says people will probably keep avoiding social interactions out of fear of contracting the virus. New IMF research shows that while government lockdowns contributed significantly to the global recession, the slowdown was also driven in large part by people abiding by social distancing guidelines. Just 28% of Americans say they already have or expect to return to workplaces before the end of the year. A new Conference Board survey says nearly 1/3 of respondents said they would be uncomfortable getting back to offices, shops, and factories, while half said their greatest concern was contracting COVID-19 at work. Only 17% of employees said they were very comfortable or even wanted to return. The Taliban is happy about President Trump's promise to have the last of America's troops out of Afghanistan by Christmas. If that withdrawal happens, it would be months ahead of schedule. The president's tweet made no reference to a Taliban promise to fight terrorist groups, a previous prerequisite for an American withdrawal. A Taliban spokesman said the president's statement was welcome and a positive step. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Coming up, dealing with an economic crisis through the lens of public health. Dean Cecilia Rouse of Princeton gives us her prescription. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. By all accounts, the economic rebound is slowing down with a long way to go before we reach full recovery. And like the events that gave us the recession to begin with, it's all up to dealing with that pandemic. We welcome now Dean Cecilia Rouse of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Dean Rouse earlier served on the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. So, Dean Rouse, thank you so much for being with us. Give us your take right now on where this economy is, how far we have to go to get back, and what do we need to do about the coronavirus to get there?
Well, our economy is in crisis because of the health crisis of the corona crisis. I am not a public health official, so I've read what you all have read, but what we understand is this is a very infectious disease, and that the best way to keep people safe, to keep mortality down, to flatten the curve in order to get through this, is we have to implement physical distancing in order to stay safe. And what that fundamentally means in an economic term is that we have to stop engaging with one another, which means we have to have a slowdown in economic activity. So our economic, where we are in terms of the economy is completely a consequence of the virus. So where are we? Well, the most recent employment report, which came out last week, which really tells us about September, tells us that the economy, unemployment rate had fallen from where it had been, is now 7.9%. But let's contrast that to the unemployment rate, which was 3.5% in February. So this is not at all an economy and an unemployment rate that we think is something to celebrate. It is still relatively high. And if we were in normal economic times, and this were a normal economic problem, we would be thinking of this as a recession. I also want to highlight that even underneath that decrease in the unemployment rate were some worrying trends. For example, we see underneath there a decrease in the labor force participation rate. So that means that an increasing number of people are not even counted among the unemployed because they've just given up looking for work. I want to highlight that even among that growing number of people who have withdrawn from the labor force is a large number that would actually like to be working, but they don't think that there are any jobs due to the pandemic. So they're not even counted in that number. It would be much higher if we were to count them as unemployed. In addition, we see that the length that people, the long-term unemployed, is increasing. So people who are unemployed have been unemployed for longer. We saw a little bit of job growth in leisure and hospitality, which is like restaurants and food services. But I think that is largely because of the warm weather, especially in colder climes. I'm here in Princeton, New Jersey. So restaurants have been able to serve customers outdoors. We now have indoor dining too. But as it gets colder, they're not going to be able to have as much activity.
So Dean Rouse, I mean, as we look around the world, around the country and around the world, we're seeing some resurgence in some places of COVID-19, whether it's in New York City or whether it's in Brussels. Is it because we've opened it up too far, too fast?
Well, I think that is some of what's happening. Again, I'm not a public health expert, and I don't understand infectious diseases. We've always been warned that there could be a second wave. And so some of that is likely because we are relaxing our own, physical distancing. Let's face it, we do have to learn to live with this virus until we completely conquer it with a really effective set of vaccines, really effective therapeutics. So until we get to the other side, we will be taking some risk. And I think that we do need to do that. It's very hard to stay sheltered in place for a year and a half. So they are likely because of that. But I'm not an infectious disease expert. They did warn us that a second wave could occur.
You're not an infectious disease expert. You are an economist, though. And as you look at the economies around the world, can you see any correlation between economies doing better because they did a better job, we think, on the public health?
So we do see that the unemployment rates in particular are not as high as in the United States. Some of this is the way in which countries try to compensate people to help get through this this economic crisis caused by the health crisis. So I do believe that economies that have kept it better under control have been able to do things such as get more children back to school. And so when children are able to go to school with appropriate safety measures, then their parents can work. One of the other phenomena we've seen is that women have withdrawn from the labor force at very high numbers because somebody needs to be home to take care of the children who are not able to go to school in person. So I do believe if we look around the world that countries that have the virus better under control haven't been suffering as much as we have. But the reality is until we're really behind this, everybody's going to be suffering to some extent.
I'm glad you raised the issue about women, particularly not participating in the workforce. And we're told in large part because, as you say, they have to take care of their children. There's still some difference there, I guess, in gender between the two. To what extent has this really, the employment situation particularly, hit some of those who have been behind anyway harder than the rest, whether it is African Americans, whether it's Hispanics, whether it's women?
So we do see that this virus, sorry, my dog has found somebody outside, that this virus has exacerbated the inequality that already existed in our economy. So in February, when this first hit, our unemployment rate was 3.5%. And so it was overall doing pretty well, but there was inequality. There were some cracks in the system. Not everybody was doing as well as others. And this virus has exacerbated those inequalities. So for example, the unemployment rate for African Americans and for Hispanics and even for women has not come down quite as quickly. So some of that is because of, as you alluded to, that within households, women often are taking care of the children more likely. It may also be that the woman has the lower paid job. And so when the decision-making is who's going to stay home to help the kids with their schoolwork, the decision is she's the one who's going to make that sacrifice. So this has exacerbated those inequalities. Many of the essential workers are some of our lower paid workers. They're the ones who are delivering our packages. Our first responders, they may be working in the police force or in emergency rooms. And so they're delivering our food for those of us who are able to stay home. So they are more at risk. They don't have as much health care. Many of them are more vulnerable. They're living in more precarious housing. So they have really taken the brunt of this pandemic.
Dean Rouse, we heard from the Fed chair, Jay Powell, this week, where he said in no uncertain terms, to get a full recovery, we need more fiscal stimulus. Do you have any doubts in your mind, as an economist who've really looked at this economy, is there any doubt in your mind we need more fiscal stimulus?
I completely agree with Chairman Powell. I actually am quite stunned that Congress has not passed another bill. I like to think of it as relief. Because in some ways we don't want to fully stimulate the economy. We want people to be able to physical distance and stay home if they need to stay home, or if there's not a job available, we need them to be able to pay their bills. But in paying their bills, that is keeping our economy afloat. Because if somebody is not able to pay their rent or is not able to buy food, that's actually money that's not going back into the economy. So what we understand is that these kinds of fiscal stimulus measures, when there's not other economic activity, actually help to keep the economy afloat. Many people worry, but our federal debt and deficit is so high. That is true. But remember, there's a denominator. So we want to think of how much federal debt there is compared to the size of the economy. As people are unable to spend money on rent and food and other essentials, or even things that they just want to spend money on, then that denominator, our economic activity, gets smaller, and we're not able to carry the debt that we do have. So the fastest way to recover is for the federal government to step in. Interest rates are extremely low. We have critical needs that we'll need to take care of. But importantly, we want to reduce the suffering, help people be able to stay in their homes, buy food, take care of their families, which will have a multiplier effect and keep the economy afloat more generally.
It's really great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. That is Dean Cecilia Rouse. She is Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now to get a check on the markets. We turn to Abigail Doolittle. And Abigail, I must say, I think you've got a new favorite word, jittery. I've heard it more than once in the last few days.
Indeed, and it goes right along with the idea of uncertainty, David. And that's what we are seeing relative to some of the volatility, because volatility can happen to the upside. That's what we're seeing today, although a relatively smaller move than what we've had over the last few days. But it really has been a case of up, down, up, down, up. Today, we are up about 0.7% at this point on the S&P 500. And to your point around jitters, investors really reacting, knee-jerk reactions, in fact, to lots of the headlines that are coming out. Today, of course, we did have Speaker of the House, who you had the pleasure of interviewing earlier today. Great interview there. And prior to that interview, she did say that there was not going to be a skinny airline stimulus deal unless there's a broader stimulus deal. So President Trump the other evening may have, or actually afternoon, may have said that there aren't negotiations, but it seems as though there's some level of negotiating here. So with stocks trading higher at this point, David, it seems as though traders probably think that at some point stimulus will get passed. And something to be point to be made around the airline deal and the broader stimulus deal. There's a much bigger difference between $25 billion targeted toward one industry and let's just call it $2 trillion. I know that that's sort of in the middle of where the Democrats and the Republicans are for the broader stimulus deal, but that's probably also why there was a quick knee-jerk reaction to the downside and then back up. Something to make note of, though, we do have bonds rallying, so investors are a little bit nervous, a little bit of hedging even as we have stocks higher.
Yeah, check me on this, Abigail. But just watching us through the course of the day, it feels like the equity market, at least, reacts immediately to whatever Nancy Pelosi says or Stephen Mnuchin says, but they don't react much, and it doesn't necessarily stick. They're concerned about the stimulus, but not that concerned.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I was just looking here before going on air. So since July 31st, the S&P 500 is up about 5%. And that, of course, was when we were supposed to first see stimulus put into place. And now it's almost, 2.5 months since that time period. So overall, that tells you that traders are optimistic that something is going to get done. And they seem, the fact that what you're talking about, I would agree that the moves, knee-jerk reactions, but relatively small to both Speaker of the House and Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, relatively small. So it just seems as though investors, traders have their mind set on the idea stimulus is going to get done, even if the road is bumpy.
Okay, thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio and TV.